The band stopped mid-note, not because the song was finished, because Kirk Douglas had leaned forward in his chair, extended one finger across the coffee table, and aimed it directly at John Wayne's chest. 400 people in the audience, 11 million more watching at home. And Kirk Douglas, Spartacus, champion, one of Hollywood's last great warriors, looked straight at the Duke and said 7 words into a live microphone. "Who the hell told you you're a cowboy?" For a moment, no one moved, not the camera operators, not the floor director gripping his clipboard with 15 years of live television behind him, not Johnny Carson, who had managed every possible crisis in late night for 13 straight years, and who now sat completely motionless, pencil frozen in the air, eyes drifting slowly from Douglas to Wayne and back again, the way a man watches something he already knows he cannot stop. John Wayne did not flinch. Blue shirt, open at the collar, dark navy scarf, legs crossed at the ankle like a man with nothing left to prove and nowhere he'd rather be. His eyes found Kirk Douglas and locked onto him, not with anger, with something much older than anger, something that had been sitting at the bottom of a very deep well for a very long time. The audience didn't laugh. They went completely silent, the way a crowd falls silent when it realizes it is no longer watching entertainment. It is watching the real thing. The Tonight Show's drummer later said he counted to 8 before he remembered how to breathe. What Wayne said in response would stop Kirk Douglas cold in front of 11 million people. But what nobody in that studio understood, what wouldn't surface for nearly 30 years, was the true reason Douglas said it. The wound behind those 7 words ran deeper than politics, deeper than rivalry. And what happened in the hallway behind stage 1, the moment those cameras went dark, that was the moment that changed both men forever. Drop a comment right now. Team Wayne or Team Douglas? Tell me where you stand before this story is over. To understand those 7 words, you have to go back 8 years, not to a television studio, to a desert. September 1966, Durango, Mexico. The war wagon set, 50 crew members standing in the rising heat of a morning that should have started at 8 o'clock. John Wayne, full costume, coffee black, no sugar, never sugar, had been standing near the camera line since 7:30, watching the road, saying nothing, just watching. Kirk Douglas arrived 90 minutes late. He had been in Los Angeles, filming a political campaign commercial for a Democratic candidate. Wayne heard the reason, walked to Douglas's trailer, and pressed one finger against his chest. Quiet voice, controlled fury, 8 words delivered like a court sentence. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., you'll be here, or I won't. Douglas showed up early the next day. Wayne showed up late, deliberately, precisely, to the minute. The score was settled. A handshake was made. Politics stays off the set, off every set, forever. The deal held, but the wound underneath it never fully healed. It just went quiet. What Kirk Douglas could never entirely make peace with was something that had nothing to do with politics. It went straight to the bone of who both men actually were. Marion Robert Morrison, born May 26, 1907, Winterset, Iowa, son of a pharmacist, not a ranch, not open land, not a single horse within 20 miles of his childhood. He had never sat in a saddle before director Raoul Walsh put him on one in 1929 for The Big Trail and told him to look like he'd been born there. Wayne looked like he'd been born there. That was the gift. That was also in the back of Kirk Douglas's mind, the thing he could never forgive. Because Isser Danielovich from Amsterdam, New York, had built everything the hard way, son of an illiterate ragman, true poverty, not the kind they put in movies, the real kind, where Humber is just Tuesday. Douglas wrestled his way through college on a scholarship, clawed into the industry, and in 1960, when every powerful man in Hollywood told him to keep Dalton Trumbo's name off Spartacus, off the blacklisted screenwriter who wrote every word of that film, Douglas put it on anyway, publicly, in print. It cost him studio contracts, friendships, and a decade of powerful enemies. Douglas didn't play a man of conviction. He was one. And yet John Wayne, Marion from Iowa, The man who learned to ride at 22 was the one America had chosen to love like a father. That was the wound, and it never stopped bleeding. For 8 years, the deal held. They kept politics off the table. They kept the wound closed. They worked in the same industry, moved through the same circles, and maintained the kind of professional distance that functions perfectly, right up until the night it doesn't. October 13th, 1974. Chasen's Restaurant, Beverly Hills. The same booth where Ronald Reagan had proposed to Nancy, where old Hollywood came when it needed to feel like old Hollywood again. Dark wood, low lighting, the smell of prime rib and expensive bourbon, and 40 years of stories told in quiet voices. Kirk Douglas was at a corner table with his wife Anne, director Otto Preminger, and a political journalist whose byline had appeared in every major publication in the country. The conversation turned, as every conversation turned in the autumn of 1974, to Nixon, to Watergate, to what it meant that the most powerful man in America had just resigned in disgrace. The country was raw. Hollywood was rawer. Douglas leaned back in his chair, swirled his glass, and said something he did not say quietly enough. The problem with this country is men like Wayne spent 30 years telling Americans what a real man looks like. Now they're surprised when they elect one and he turns out to be a crook. Preminger laughed. The journalist reached for his notepad. 12 feet away, at a separate table, John Wayne set down his knife, finished the rest of his meal in complete silence, left without dessert, never once looked in Douglas's direction. That night, at 11:47, Douglas received a call from Carson's producer. The message was brief and professional. Wayne was requesting a separate green room for the following evening's taping. He did not wish to share space with someone who used his name as a political instrument. Douglas held the receiver against his ear for a long moment. Then, tell him I'll be in the green room. He can go wherever he chooses. He set the phone down, sat alone in his study for 20 minutes. The room was quiet, just the sound of the city outside and the particular silence of a decision forming. Douglas had spent his entire career absorbing Hollywood's punishments without answering them publicly. He had taken them and nodded and kept moving. He was 57 years old and he was done nodding. Wayne wanted a war, fine, but Douglas would choose the battlefield. Not a desert, not a studio lot, live television. 11 million viewers. No script, no second takes, no retraction possible once the words left his mouth. He knew exactly what he was going to say. He had known it, somewhere underneath everything, for 8 years. If you're still here, you already know this is different. Subscribe and never miss a story this powerful again. October 14th, 1974, NBC Studio One, Burbank, California, 10:58 p.m. The Tonight Show set was warm wood and amber light, built deliberately to feel like a living room so that 11 million Americans watching at home would feel like they had simply pulled up a chair. Johnny Carson had spent 13 years perfecting that illusion. The right temperature of light, the right angle of the desk, the right distance between the guest chairs so that two people can sit close enough to feel intimate and far enough apart that neither one felt cornered. Tonight, the distance felt like nothing at all. Both men had been booked for the same segment weeks earlier. A rare double appearance Carson had arranged before the Chasen's dinner, before the phone calls, before any of it. His producer had tried to separate them after the green room request. Carson had said no, keep it. He understood something no producer wanted to put in writing. The best television was the kind you could not predict. Douglas came out first. Black suit, white shirt, no tie. He moved like a man who had already made every decision that needed making. The audience applauded warmly. He sat in the first guest chair, crossed one leg over the other, and smiled at Carson with the calm of someone who has already loaded the gun and is simply waiting for the right moment to raise it. Then Wayne walked out. The audience didn't just applaud, they rose. Not all of them, but enough. He walked the way he always walked, weight forward, shoulders set, like a man who expected the ground to hold him, and had never once been wrong about that. He shook Carson's hand, nodded at Douglas, sat down. Carson opened easily. Industry small talk, a question about the changing landscape of Hollywood, the new directors, the new films, the new kind of story Americans seem to want. Wayne answered the way he always answered. Direct, unhurried, a little dismissive of what he didn't respect. He said something about how the new films had forgotten what audiences actually came for. Clear stories, clear heroes, men who stood for something you could name. Cowboys, he said, and smiled at the audience, and the audience smiled back. Douglas turned in his chair. Slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has been waiting for exactly this word. Cowboys, Douglas repeated, and something in his voice made Carson's pencil stop mid-tap. That's interesting, Duke, because who the hell told you you're a cowboy? Marion Morrison from Winterset, Iowa, never sat on a horse before somebody handed him a screenplay and told him where to look. 400 people stopped breathing simultaneously. Carson did not move. His pencil hung in the air above his notepad. His eyes went from Douglas to Wayne and held there. The stillness of a man watching something irreversible happen in slow motion, and understanding that the only correct response is to get completely out of the way. Wayne looked at Douglas. 8 full seconds of silence, so absolute that the boom microphone picked up the sound of a woman shifting in her seat 40 rows back. His face did not change. Not one line, not one muscle, just his eyes, locked onto Douglas with an expression that Carson would spend the next 30 years trying to describe accurately in his private journal, and never quite manage. Then Wayne uncrossed his ankles, leaned forward very slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Carson had to tilt almost imperceptibly toward him to catch the words. "You're right," Wayne said. "I never rode a horse before 1929. First time I climbed on one, I was 22 years old, and I was terrified." He let that land, every word finding its place in the silence. "But I got on, and I didn't fall off, and I came back the next morning, and the morning after that. 30 years of mornings, Kirk." A pause, measured, unhurried, surgical. "You want to call that fiction? Because from where I'm sitting, that sounds like the only story worth telling." The audience erupted. Not polite applause, not the warm, trained response of a studio crowd following a laugh sign. Something that came from deeper. Surprise colliding with recognition, colliding with the electric, irreplaceable charge of witnessing something genuinely real. Douglas sat back slowly. His finger was still extended. Then 1 inch at a time, he lowered it. His face held an expression that Carson had never seen on him in 20 years of interviews. Not defeat, not embarrassment. Something older, something that had been waiting a long time to finally surface. Carson said nothing. For the first and possibly only time in 13 years of hosting, he let the silence do the work and trusted it completely. What happened the moment those cameras went dark? What Kirk Douglas said to John Wayne in an empty hallway, with no audience and no microphone, is the part of this story nobody was supposed to know. The cameras cut at 12:14 a.m. The studio lights dropped from performance white to maintenance yellow in the space of 3 seconds. The band packed up. The audience moved toward the exit, still arguing in low voices, still carrying the electricity of what they had just witnessed, the way people carry something they don't yet have words for. Wayne was already moving. Blue shirt, navy scarf, headed toward the talent exit at the back of the stage. Long strides, eyes forward. He had said what he came to say, and he was done. Duke. One word, Douglas's voice, behind him. No performance in it. None of the projection. None of the actor's instinct to fill a room. Just a man's voice in a corridor. Wayne stopped walking. He did not turn around. Douglas caught up. They stood together in the hallway connecting the dressing rooms to the stage exit. Concrete floor, industrial lighting, a monitor mounted on the wall still showing the empty Tonight Show desk. Carson's pencil was still sitting at the edge of the notepad where he had set it down during those 8 seconds. He had walked off and forgotten it entirely. Douglas stood beside Wayne, not facing him, beside him, Both men looking at the same wall. I said it because you scare me. Wayne turned his head a fraction. Not like that. Douglas pushed both hands into his jacket pockets. You scare me because I have been watching you for 30 years, and I cannot find the seam. I cannot find the place where Marion Morrison ends and John Wayne begins, and I have looked. The corridor hummed with the sound of the building settling around them. I spent my whole life building something real, fighting real fights, paying real costs. And you built something that never existed, and America loved it more than anything I ever did that was true. He stopped. The words had been somewhere inside him for the better part of a decade, and now that they were out, they sounded smaller than he expected, more honest, more tired. Wayne was quiet long enough that Douglas genuinely believed he was going to walk away without answering. Then Wayne turned. Not all the way, just enough to look at him directly. You put Dalton Trumbo's name on Spartacus, 1960. I fought you on it, loudly and publicly, and I meant every word of it. A pause. But I knew what it cost you. I knew exactly what you were walking into, and I watched you walk into it anyway. His voice dropped slightly. I didn't agree with you then. I don't agree with you now, but a man who pays that kind of price for something he believes, that's not nothing, Kirk. That was never nothing. Douglas looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not forgiveness, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a stone for 8 years and has just set it down long enough to feel the full weight of his empty hands. No handshake, no agreement reached, no resolution tied with a clean bow. Just two men in an empty hallway, fluorescent lights humming above them, finally telling each other the truth with nobody watching and nothing left to protect. Carson's producer turned the corner 30 seconds later, saw them standing there, and immediately turned back around. He told the story carefully to 3 people over the next 20 years. None of them believed him. This is the kind of moment they never put in the history books. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes men like this existed. Johnny Carson never talked about that night publicly. Not once. Not in interviews, not in the occasional profile piece, not in the rare moments when journalists pushed him toward the personal. He deflected the way he always deflected, with a joke, a raised eyebrow, a smooth pivot to something safer. 13 years of live television had made him the most skilled redirector in the history of the medium. But he wrote it down. Carson kept a private journal throughout his career. Not a diary in the traditional sense, more like a working document. Observations, fragments, things he witnessed that he couldn't process on camera. After his death, in January 2005, his closest collaborators found several entries that had never been mentioned to anyone. One of them was dated October 14, 1974. It read, "Wayne and Douglas tonight. I have done over 4,000 shows. I have never been as frightened as I was in those 8 seconds. Not for the broadcast, not for the network, for Wayne. I was certain he was going to stand up and walk off that stage. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply waited. I have never in my life seen a man so completely at home inside silence." Further down the same entry, Carson wrote about what he had seen in Wayne's face during those seconds. The thing that had stayed with him long after the cameras cut and the audience went home. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. For just a moment, before he answered, Duke looked like a man who was exhausted from having to prove something he had already proven 1,000 times. There was something in his eyes that I recognized immediately and hoped nobody else had caught. It was grief. Old grief. The kind that doesn't go away, it just learns to sit quietly. Then, written beneath that in different ink, added later, perhaps the following morning, in the particular stillness of a decision already made. The measure of a man is not how he attacks. It is how he absorbs. Tonight, Wayne absorbed everything, and I don't think Douglas will ever fully recover from the fact that he did. John Wayne and Kirk Douglas never shared a public stage again. They worked in the same industry, moved through the same circles, and kept their distance with the quiet precision of 2 men who had said everything that needed saying and understood that some conversations are complete the moment they end. Wayne was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1978. He told almost no one. He kept working. He showed up the way he had always shown up, the way he had spent 50 years showing up, because that was the only answer he had ever known how to give. Douglas called him in the spring of 1979. Wayne answered on the second ring. Douglas said, "I never apologized for that night." A silence. "I know," Wayne said. "I'm apologizing now." Another silence. Longer this time. Then, "Apology accepted, John. Come see me sometime." Douglas came. They spent one afternoon together at Wayne's home in Newport Beach, California. They did not discuss The Tonight Show. They talked about their sons. Wayne died June 11th, 1979. He was 72 years old. Kirk Douglas outlived him by 41 years. He died February 5th, 2020, at 103. In his final interview, 2 years before the end, a journalist asked about John Wayne. Douglas looked away for a long moment. Then he said, "He was the real thing, and I knew it. That was the problem. I always knew it." He paused. "I never found a seam either." Two legends, one hallway, one truth that took a lifetime to say out loud. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and leave one comment. Who walked out of that night with more dignity?